So if you can, just please join me in prayer as we just seek God's words today. And so, Father God, we just thank you again for another day, another chance just to be reminded of your love, your mercy, your grace. We just continue to just pray that you keep opening our hearts to you, continue just to seek our hearts and eyes and minds to be shaped, to be more like you, to see the way you see things, and to seek all the things that you want us to seek. And so I just pray that we're able to just love more through your words, through your example, and continue just to love the way you want us to love. And I just pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we're going to be looking at Ephesians chapter 5, verses 25 through 33. It's there on the handout with you guys, and on the screen. You guys can read it with me. It says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband." All right, so the title of this sermon is Love Like Jesus Loves the Church. So my original title was Marriage Equals Death. That's why I have all the black outfit. I had that title. I dropped off my clothes to get pressed, right, for the Sunday, and then God changed it for me. Because for the most part, it's not about marriage. It's actually about loving like Jesus. And even for yourselves, you guys might think, like, how can a single guy teach us about marriage and love? I don't know. It's just the way it worked out. But for the most part, for all of us, it's about loving like Christ, right? So I was joking. I was telling some people were like, even in the Army, I was close to getting married twice. And so both of the women broke up with me, and they gave me the same breakup speech, which is kind of funny. It's like identical in words. But basically, they were saying that they think I'm special, but I'm already married because I'm married to the Army and my men, right? They're like, I put them first. The way I love them, it always came first. And so they're like, your heart's not available for somebody else, right? And so I was like, yo, okay, it's weird that it's heard it twice, right? But they were not wrong. They were not wrong in that sense where it's like, I saw the way Jesus tells you to love people. I try to live that out, and that's what somebody saw, right? And so I'll share a little bit later about how that works out, how that looks. But it's important to look at this text and understand that it's actually more about Jesus loving the church than it is about marriage. Because a lot of times when we read these texts, sometimes, if you're not married, you might just kind of tone out the message like, oh, it's not for me, it's for husbands and wives. But look at this section a little bit more closely, right? At the very beginning says, husband loves your wives as Christ loved the church. So he's trying to use marriage as an example of how Christ loves. Then it says that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle. That's not what a husband does for a wife, right? That's what Jesus, it's all about the first three sentences are about Jesus, what he does for the church based on his love. And that's where after he says that, then he's like, in the same way, husbands do this, right? And so the whole, they're not one flesh. They're no longer, nobody hates their own flesh, right? Nourish it, cherish it, just as Christ does the church. Once again, Jesus is saying we're all one flesh. We're all one body, one race, right? One family. This is why we cherish it. This is why I treat you as one. So it's continuing to use Jesus' love, his view. And so then he uses the text, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, two shall become one flesh. If you notice what he says right after that, this mystery is profound. We know what marriage is like. We know that marriage is about people coming together to become one, right? Marriage has been around since the beginning of time. This text is from Genesis. Christians, all of God's followers have known what marriage is about. So then why does Paul say it's a profound mystery? Because he's saying us joining God's body as one flesh. That is the mystery that Jesus is solving. His actions is showing us what it's about. That's why it says the mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. Don't you realize it's actually more about, how many people agree it's more about loving the church than it is about husband loving wives? Or are you guys 50-50 right now? I said 50. I got one hand. Thank you. One hand. That's all I need. All right? And then that's where it ends. However, let each one of you love your wife as himself. right? So you can see like his language is really talking about this love, loving like Christ, and then he's using marriage as an example of one way to see how people become one. So we're going to look at that, look at those examples, but this is where it's important to understand. Paul is trying to elevate their level of love to love like Christ. If you actually look at this full section, and if you ever look at all the marriage codes that he writes in the different books, there's an order that precedes it. Last time I was up here, I shared how Ephesians and Colossians look exactly alike. Love God, do this, right? And so this is where it's kind of like his pattern. If you look at the full chapter, I have it there laid out for you. The first thing he always tells you, it starts with loving God. Then the next thing is to walk in love, walk in light. As you do that, love everyone as yourself. Then that love flows to all relationships. Does that make sense? That's where every single one, it's like love God first. He's going to teach you how to love the right way. You're going to try to walk in it. That will then mean you love everybody else. If you love everybody else, then naturally, whatever relationship you have, you'll be able to love them the right way. Does that make sense? But it's that flow of loving God and then just going to walk in it, everybody else, love flows that relationship. Because this is where, Paul kind of says this, right? Over and over again, submit to one another. It's kind of funny when I know a lot of Christian wives or women, they're like, I don't want to submit. I don't want to submit. That's one of my issues. And I get it. I understand why they say that. I don't like submit either. But I kind of laugh in a way where it's like every Christian is supposed to submit to everyone. That text precedes any of your relationship texts about how children and parents work together, how slaves and masters, all that stuff. It always started with you submit to one another. Does that make sense? So as a Christian, for everybody, we have to submit to one another. You actually get practice because you're submitting to one another that it's a lot easier to submit in your relationships. Does that make sense? Because usually in a relationship, you guys are more focused towards the same type of goal. You guys want the same things in life. So it's actually easier to get together than it is with a fellow believer that wants all kinds of different stuff. And so that's where it's like, if you can master submitting to one another in the church, then technically every relationship will be that much easier. That was the intention that Paul writes. And so Paul continually talks about loving by example, and then people will follow. And so the beginning of this chapter, that's what it said. Therefore, be imitators of God. Verse 2, walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. He continues to keep pointing it all to Christ's example of love. This is how you love somebody. This is how you treat them. This is what it means to submit. He submits first. Right? So it's his example. It's all about following an example. And so the reason why, and it's actually very important why he's continuing to use and lead by example as his way to set these men and women and everybody straight. Because of the culture that it was written to, you have to understand why he's talking about setting an example versus telling them how to specifically behave and how they should do everything. Pastor Chang hit on it a little bit about how marriage was back then. They didn't always view equality, but it's actually a little bit deeper than that. So you got to remember, he's writing to Ephesus. There's a reason why he's specifying about how to love their wives and how to love each other. Does anybody know that there's other letters written to Ephesus in the Bible? There's actually 3 letters written to Ephesus. Does anybody know the other 2? God didn't make it easy by calling them 1, 2, 3 Ephesus. But there's 2 other letters to Ephesus. Does anybody know what they are? No? Okay, so that's part. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy are written to the leader of the church of Ephesus. Timothy is supposed to be in charge of that church, and so that first letter is written, this is what you need to do to lead these people. Right? It's a letter for how to lead those people. It's all about Ephesus. 2 Timothy is Paul's last encouragement for him to keep working hard and keep being the right minister for the church at Ephesus. Right? So it's all about that. So when you know that these letters are actually kind of combined, or some of the things the way that Paul tells Timothy to lead, it actually is for these people. What is their culture, what they're used to? If you know 1 Timothy, there's actually qualifications for deacons and elders. In that qualification, one of them is be the husband of one wife. This is where you get to see and understand what was it like in Ephesus. The husbands could have as many wives as they wanted. They didn't matter. right? They could just keep building more power, more wealth. You get more and more wives. So now you understand why he's trying to then rein them back in about understanding about loving your wife the right way, right? Even being loyal to one wife. That's where he's trying to use this God example of like God is loyal to us, right? God, the whole, God is jealous, all this other stuff. Like you're supposed to be one. So he's talking to a group that has multiple wives. So Paul could not change that culture. He could not tell them not to do that. He could only make it that church leaders could not have multiple wives. That's why you see the qualification in Timothy and not in Ephesus. Does that make sense? So because he knows these people, they're too far on one side. They need to get to where Christ and the true way of loving. So what's going to be the bridging gap? And so the first start is love like Jesus, love the way he's committed to everybody. Right? And so if you look at 1 Timothy, there's more of it where, in 4:11-12, it says, command and teach these things. Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. Paul continues to set this kind of mindset. If you set the example, people will then follow it. You don't need to tell them. You don't need to order them. If you do it, people will follow. In 2 Timothy, he kind of establishes that. You, however, have followed my teaching, my conduct, my aim, my life, my faith, my patience, my love, my steadfastness, my persecutions and sufferings that happened to me at Antioch, at Iconium, and at Lystra, which persecutions I endured. Yet from them all the Lord rescued me. He tells them right there, you learn from my teachings and my conduct, all the ways I handle these things. Right? So Paul is telling them, if you set the example the right way, people will follow. Jesus set the right example. I followed. All the apostles followed. You saw my example. You saw Jesus' example. You're following me. Keep doing it. Does that make sense? So this is where we kind of understand why he's writing these words. He's trying to tell them in order to love people, you got to set the example and they will follow. Submit to them in a way that will make them want to change the way they live. Submit in a way that makes them see a better way to live. It's all about example. It's all about example. All right? And so, for some of you, do you think that example matters? Do you think that, it works? Do you think that, hey, if I do it enough, somebody will change? That's all I want to shake though. All right. And it's okay. It's true. Because one of the questions you always have to ask yourself, how many years, how long do you set that example? That's something between you and God. But for me, I've seen this lived out very well. I've seen that, I try to follow Jesus' example and others then followed. All right. So I'll share a little bit of my military experience. Because this is why I said, why I shared I was married to the Army. When I was studying to be a pastor, right, I was doing my undergrad. I only had 1 year left in the military. Then my unit got orders to go to Afghanistan. I could turn down going to Afghanistan because you have to have so much time left on your contract for them to send you, right? So I had a choice. Do I go to Afghanistan, fight for my soldiers, or do I just keep following God's path, finish my undergrad, go to seminary, do all that stuff, be the pastor that he called me to be, right? Because even for me, I know I've always dreamed about going to Iraq and Afghanistan. That was my dream when I joined the Army. I wanted to do both. I wanted to have both belts. I did both wars. But now that I had gotten God's call, I was like, maybe he doesn't want that for me, right? So as I was ready to not go, and I was dating somebody, right, it had a chance to have a future, all the guys, all the families are like, dude, we need you to go, right? You're the one that's the best leader. You're the guy that's going to make sure we come home. You're the one that's going to fight for us like nobody else does. You're going to be the one that just really knows how to lead, right, and look out for us more than yourself. And so all these families, all my friends, they asked me to make the sacrifice, right? And so in that moment, I did. I said, yes. As I talked to God about it, I was like, God, I know you have this path for me, but at the same time, you've never let me not take care of my people. Does that make sense? So it's if I go off to ministry and something happens to them, obviously that's going to be a painful thing for me. So I was like, God, with your permission, let me go. Let me do what you made me to do. And so he gave me that permission, right? Obviously, I went to Afghanistan. That relationship went away. But for the most part, I got to serve. I got to do a lot for my men. And so at the very end of my time, I did this very big project. And so I was tested in a lot of ways of how I would sacrifice for them, how I would love them. But basically, there was one thing that I did that I tell people that it's what I did to save 102 people's lives. All right? I wish it was like me jumping on guns and shooting everybody, but that story's not that cool. It's just me doing Jesus-type love. And so in this situation, in this time period, we had to build this huge heliport airport, right, or helicopter airport. So they were going to reshift all the bases on Afghanistan. They were trying to shrink down, so they were going to shut down 8 small bases in the southern side of Afghanistan. It was going to be all condensed into one major place, right? Fuel, ammo, all that stuff. So this was the biggest project the Army was doing. This was what mattered the most. This was strategic for the whole realignment of everything. So I was working with this unit from the Wisconsin National Guard. They were the best construction people, equipment operators, things like that. And I was the best surveyor in the country at the time. And so they put us together. We were supposed to do this project. And so as we're out there, the main command told this unit from Wisconsin, you're not going home until this project is done. It's too far, because it was like, it's too important. You guys can't leave until it's done. And so they were like, you have 2 months to finish it. And this was a very tough project, very tough area to build in. And there was a lot of danger to do this. And so it was kind of like, it was almost unrealistic to finish it in 2 months. But the military doesn't care if it's realistic or not. They said, get it done. And so as these guys are struggling with it, right, they're kind of like, man, how are we going to do it? I'm trying to give them confidence, like, dude, we're going to come up with a plan. We're going to make this happen. Like, we're going to be sipping Gatorades later. But basically, as we're dealing with this commanders, right, their unit, the main leader of this group was like, all right, we need to make our work schedule as packed as possible, work these guys like they've never worked before. And so he was kind of like, we're going to make it to where they're going to skip lunch, right? Like, they'll eat these small meals. And so there's something called MREs. They're called meals ready to eat. Like, you just eat them when you're out camping or in the woods. These meals are not very good. They don't taste that well. There's a lot of issues with them. Sometimes when you eat them, you just have to go to the bathroom all the time. There's other times when you eat them, you can't go to the bathroom for weeks, right? Like, it's just this crazy stuff where it's like, you do not want to eat these if you don't have to, right? And so as we're building this huge airport thing, it's right on the outside of the base, right? So we're not like out in the middle of the woods. We're not, isolated. Like, if that was the case, we would understand that's what we're supposed to eat. But when you're living on the base, you always get hot meals, right? Like, that's the best part of it. So for these guys, they're like, we're so close. We're right outside the base. We're outside these walls. And the dining facility, we can see it. We can smell it. But we're not allowed to go get it, right? So it messes with your morale. Because for the most part, like, we're going outside these walls, right? So we have to create a hole in the wall, and then we drive our trucks out, create security, make sure everything's checked, and then we bring out our equipment. And all the time, right, you got to do security every time you go outside. Put all your body armor and stuff like that. So that leader was like, it makes no sense to have them do that and go eat lunch in the dining facility because it's going to take too much time to go in and out, right? So he's like, we can't spare any time. And so as I'm sitting there, I'm like, dude, this is going to be the most stressful job that they're ever going to do. This is going to be physically demanding, nonstop. They need to eat well, right, to be able to do this for 2 months. And so as I'm trying to convince this leader, I'm like, okay, I'm trying to think through, right? I'm a good problem solver. I'm like, all right, what if you just send a couple of the guys to go pick up food? You can easily get to-go plates at our dining facility, right? They'll pack it up. As long as you send 3 guys, they can go get the food and bring it out to them. No, I can't spare 3 people. I need people working nonstop, every single minute, 100%. I was like, what are you talking, like, dude? And so I'm trying to tell them, like, man, like, technically, there's times no equipment can run all the time, right? Some equipment has to do it, then another. Even when I do my job to check their progress, they can't work when I'm doing it. And so that's why I was trying to tell this guy, right, like, there's so many times of gaps of time period, you can let these guys get taken care of. And so I'm not in charge of this guy. I can't tell him how to run his 100 people, but I am in charge of the project of what they do, right? So it's this weird balance of power. Like, technically, I could try to trump them, but it's going to be very hard, especially for something like that, right? The military doesn't prioritize soldier care like that. So as I'm trying to talk to this guy, right, I'm like convincing him, like, dude, this is not going to be well for them. It's not going to go well for them if you do this. And so I'm trying to give him options, right? And he's like, dude, I know these guys. I've been working them for 6 months, day in and day out, mission after mission. They're going to need this, right? And so he's like, you don't know them as well as I do. I've known them for years. And so as I'm like, man, no soldier can do this that hard for that long without proper nutrition. And so he's like, man, so he starts complaining. The soldiers of, these days are so soft. Back in my day, we were so tough. We were this and that. We didn't need this kind of breaks, and they should be mentally strong. Right? I'm sure you guys have heard these kind of conversations, right? But that's where he's like, they're weak, they're this and that. So I'm like, man, like, what are you talking about, right? It's like every soldier in the history of soldiering would prefer a hot meal over travel rations, right? Like, my dad from Vietnam would not want to eat those meals. People from Korea, World War II, I've met them, I know them. Even Roman soldiers back from this text was written. Everybody would prefer a hot meal before they go off to fight versus some little travel meal. It's like, why are you going to try to tell me soldiers that nowadays? And so as this guy won't budge, I can't change his mind, right? I'm angry. I'm frustrated. I'm like, this guy is going to get these guys killed, right? Because a lot of times if, you're not eating right, you're tired, you can fall asleep on security, right? And the enemy can come up. If you have a lot of bathroom issues, I have to go back and forth. The enemy will time your schedule and attack you when you're half force. I mean, like, they literally watch you watch every movement that you make. So I'm like, you're literally trying to set us up for failure. And so as I'm struggling with this, right, I'm like, my job is to bring these guys home, get them home safe. I can't do that because this dumb leader will not submit and love them the way they need to be loved. And so as I'm thinking through all these crazy, violent solutions, I'm like, God, your way, I got to do it your way, right? I'm a pastor. I'm a pastor at the time, right? I was like, I got to do it the pastorly way. And so I'm like, okay, God, I know all my ideas are not under that umbrella, so I need you to give me something. And so I was like, God, what should I do? And so he's kind of like, he reminds me, right? God has always been about feeding people. I've always loved how Jesus does the 5,000, the 4,000, some of these episodes when he really sacrificed to feed the people, right? God reminded me of in Exodus when he's feeding everybody for 40 years, right? Day in, day out. And so me, it was like God's all about feeding people. And I'm like, okay, God, so God kind of asked me, like, can't you feed them? And so I'm like, interesting. Okay. So normally that's not my job, right? My job, I'm isolated from these guys. I'm supposed to just supervise them, make sure they build it to the proper specifications. My job is to make sure it'll survive all these helicopters and stuff landing, right? Like I'm supposed to be an impartial observer. I'm not supposed to be like ingrained in I'm not their family in a sense. But at the same time, like I've been living with them, doing all this stuff. They've been taking care of me, doing all these other things. So I'm like, they're definitely my family. And so I'm like, okay, God, like I could do it. And so the problem was, like, in order to feed them, right, it would take a lot of my time to go out, get the food. And so normally I'm on the project sites. I go in and out multiple times a day to check on stuff. But I'm also supposed to be doing reports, things like that, sending things, checking some of the quality that they're building. And so that requires me to do stuff on my own. And so if I put it off and not do it during my lunchtime like I'm supposed to, then my nighttime will be a bunch of work. And so at the time, every night I would be doing my Bible classes, right? I was doing my online classes while I was in war zones, right? I was studying Daniel and John at the time. And so as I'm doing this, I'm like, dang, like I'm not going to have time for homework. I'm not going to have all this other stuff, right? Like it's really going to make me suffer across the board. But I'm like, I can't just be studying Bible classes about loving people and sacrifices for them and doing what's right, and then I'm just ignoring these people. I just didn't see that as God's direction for my life, right? It's like God's like, make the sacrifice. So number one, it was a sacrifice of time. Number two, it's a danger to go bring food to them every single day. Because they're outside the walls, you have to put your body armor on every single time to go bring them food. Every single time you're by the walls, the enemy sees you, and you're closer that they can attack you. When I'm normally doing my lunch break and I'm back in my home there, like I'm in the very middle of the base, I'm very well protected. They can't get me, right? There's a reason why I live where I live, because I'm important to the military's planning. And so, but when I go out to the walls every single time, now the enemy can get me. Does that make sense? So if I bring them meals every single day, it's a danger. Because even during lunchtime, it's always dangerous because they always see you guys. When everybody goes to eat, right, they can see there's smaller people paying attention to security. That's when you get attacked a lot. Plus, they know you eat in circles. They know we're social people. They try to bomb you when you're eating together, right? So it's not like it's just, hey, there's no sacrifice to this. And so I'm like, okay, God, you want me to do this? I know that, I'm not worried about risking my life. Like, I wouldn't be here if I was. And so I'm going to do what you want me to. So at the time, I had two people that I led, two soldiers. And so for them, I could order them to help me get the food and bring it to the soldiers, right? My job is project management. If I believe that's what's best for the project, I can literally tell them, yes, I'm going to risk your lives to make sure these guys live. That's all within my authority. That's all within my right. Right? I could tell them this is what's needed. You'd have to do it. No choice. But I'm not that kind of leader. I've never tried to be that way, right? I'm always like, you got to make the choice. So I sat my two guys down and told them, this is the situation. This is what's going on, right? These guys, this is what's going to happen. They're going to have to be doing this. I believe we should feed them. I believe that we should love them this way and help take care of them. And so I told them there's two risks, right? The risk of us bringing food to them is obviously there. We're going to keep having to put our armor on. We're going to have to keep going outside the walls. We're going to have to keep putting ourselves, in areas that we could be attacked. Yes, that's dangerous. But there's also a danger if we do nothing. We have to be out there 2 or 3 times a day anyways. If these guys are not at the top of their game, if they're not paying attention while they're on security, we are exposed while we're out there. So there's a great potential that when we're there, we could get attacked and get killed either way, right? So it's kind of like, what choice, what action do you want to do and die for? What do you want to live for? What do you want to die for? And so I was like, I'm going to do it to take care of them. I told them, if you don't want to do it, that's fine, right? Because I told you guys the families asked me to take care of them and bring them home, right? So I always promise I'm not going to put them in harm's way if I don't have to. And so I told them, I won't force you, I won't order you to do this. It's your choice. And I won't judge you if you want to stay safe. If you feel like you don't want to go out there every single time when you don't need to, that's okay. That's not your job. That's not your calling. For me, I'm going to do it. Don't worry about it. right? So I was like, just take care of yourself. Think about your family. Think about what's important to you, and I'll back you up whatever choice you make. And so as the first guy's name was Evidia, he's like, I'll do it. I'll do it with you right away, right? And so I shared this story where there was this one soldier that came to Colorado that, he lost all his money, right? Car broke down, all that stuff. And so I loaned the guy the money and told him not to pay me back. Turned out that was this guy. He ended up on my team, right, in the future. And he was like, dude, you helped me when I was down. You helped me when I had nothing. You helped me before you even knew me and didn't want nothing back. I've been waiting to do something to pay you back. I know you didn't want money back. This is what you'd want. You'd want somebody to carry on doing what you do for people. I was like, right on, brother. Like, that's what, right? I was like, yes, like the example worked, right? The other guy, his name was Dobler. He was the most selfish person I ever met. When I got him, he was all about himself, right? Like, it's part of his history and experience. But that's why I took him under my team. They're like, if anybody could teach him how to care about people, how to lead and put his soldiers first, I can do it. And so as I'm talking to him, I was like, dude, what are you going to do? And he was like, you know what? Like, I'm going to do it too. He's like, every single time, like, back when we were in the States, back when we were training, anytime the leaders would mess up and we would lose our lunches, right, or lose the opportunity to go eat, you would always cover our lunch. You would always take us out, pay for our lunch, do all this other stuff. Anytime it was super hard and, we were asked to do a bunch of stuff, you invented the trifecta of eating Jamba Juice, L&L, Cold Stone. You would take us out, eat, and feed us all the time to make up for what we had to do. Right? It's like you sacrificed all the time, and food was one of the major ways you did it. And he's like, every time you did that, we've given you more and more. Like, we work harder for you than anybody else. So I know that this works. If you say that this will help these guys work harder to help keep us safe, then I'm with you 100%. Right? Your example that you've set, I'm going to do the same thing. Right? I was like, that's what I'm talking about, right? And so in this moment, I was like, man, it was a good God moment where I was like, man, like, I've been trying to do what you put me here, God, you led this path. You told me how to do it. You're giving me, and it worked all those years of leading these guys, right? The example that I tried to set by just merely following Jesus' example, these two guys followed that example, right? And I won't go in detail of how like bad of a people they were, because basically, moral. If you ask what kind of moral character they had, they did not have very good moral character. They weren't Christians. The guy Vidia, he actually led a sex club in his off time, right? He was like an atheist, self-proclaimed atheist. Right? All these type of things. He did not believe in Christian love and stuff like that. But the example is what changed his mind. This guy, because that's what he always said, like, Christians don't love, Christians don't sacrifice, Christians don't do this. I don't know why would I follow that. So I gave him a chance to come see this, right? The Dobler guy was a very similar type of story. And so it gave me a great example. It gave a great chance to set this example. When it came time to say goodbye to all these guys, when I left 100 people, we sent our goodbyes, right? All of them were like, dude, like, you're going to make a great pastor one day, right? Like, you did everything necessary to bring us home. You did everything necessary. Like, we wish you could be our pastor back home, right? And so it was this great moment where I was like, man, following Jesus' example of love can change even the hardest of hearts. It can change people that are so far away from the gospel. It's just beyond what we could ever imagine. Does that make sense? So for the most part, that's what Paul is basically facing that same situation. Ephesus, their background, their culture is so far away from loving like God loves. But this is who God called. This is who God's saving. And so what's the way that they're going to go from this culture to God culture? And it's us setting the example over and over and over again, all day long, every day, every possible way. Love, love, love like Christ. All right? And so it worked for Paul. There's a lot of strong case, a lot of strong faith that came out of that. And that's why I said it continues to work to this day. And so as we understand, right, this example works, it's important to understand what example we're supposed to follow. And that is love the way Christ does. So this section, 521, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ, is always about Christ. It's always about him, always the way he did it. A lot of times we only focus on how Jesus loved. We forget that he is actually meant to be the perfect example of following an example. Does that make sense? He's the perfect example of following an example. The reason why I say that, Jesus over and over again said, everything I do, I've seen the Father do. Everything that I am, I saw the Father. Everything I want to do is what the Father wants to do. I cannot do anything on my own. I do not want to do what I want. It's always the Father. Father, Father, Father. I'm following my Father's example. This is in the John, if you study, John has it, right? So Jesus said to them, it's on the handout, truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing on his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. And greater works than these will he show him, so that you may marvel. For as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. John 5:30, I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Jesus is telling us it's all about following an example. I follow the Father's example. I can do all these things because I just keep following his example. Anytime I'm struggling, anytime I don't know what to do, he's like, I remember what the Father would do. I remember what he would want. And I just keep following that example over and over and over again. I've been around him so long, I can't help but just do what he does. I've been around him so long, I can't help but want what he wants. Right? That's where we see Jesus saying, like this example, following the example. And so obviously we get Jesus to give us an even better example of walking on earth as a human in flesh, so it gives us an easier chance to try to be more like him and try to be more like our Father. But this is where we see, like, it's all about loving the way Christ does. It all comes down to following an example. That's when we talk about submission. What does it mean to submit? It means to follow someone else's example, someone else's guidance. Jesus is literally saying, I follow the Father's example and guidance because it's better than mine. That's what that 5:30 says. Like, I can do nothing on my own. As I judge and I do my judgments, it's because God's telling me. Did Jesus pick his 12 apostles? No. Right before when he starts his ministry, he goes off on his own to pray for the Father. Father, pull out the 12 that I'm supposed to have. Create do this, do that. Every single time Jesus is about to do something, he always has time to seek the Father first, and then he follows that direction. Right? He's setting that example of like the reason why this is the best, the reason why this is the way to love or the right action is because I spent time seeking the Father's will, and I'm doing what he wants because I know what he wants is best. Does that make sense? So that's when we see this whole submission thing of like, it's not about just following orders, it's about seeking together. And so as we talk about this, love the way Christ does, I'm going to try to give us that more practical application of this is out of that 1 Corinthians 13 text. I've used this before. I gave an in-depth analysis of what all the different things were. But it's important to actually look at this text in its full level, right, to understand like what example are we trying to follow. So if you remember, I was talking about Ephesus. This church is all about, pleasure, but it's all about power. Power, 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 right? The more power you have, the more power you exert, the better the person you are, the more special you are. It's part of why they had so many wives, why they did all that stuff. They wanted to show that they could have everything. They wanted to show how good they were, right? So it was all about power. Paul is talking about submission because he's trying to give them a counterculture of what they're used to. You think power makes you special. Power makes you important. And it's like, no, putting others first, doing other stuff, that's what makes you special. That's what makes, because it's like God, right? So a lot of these cultures that he's writing to are all the same, right? If you look at 1 Corinthians in the very beginning, it says, if I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Just right there, right? For most Christians, we think, if I do a lot of these things, if I serve a lot of people, if I do this, I'm good. I'm doing everything I'm supposed to, right? The whole faith to move mountains. You guys know most of my stories. I've done some pretty crazy, wild stuff, faced a lot of challenges, never back down. Most people would say I have faith to move mountains, physical, mental, spiritually. But even God's like, but you don't love. So, sorry, that's a lot of work that you put in, but it's nothing. Right? Yes, so you have so much faith, but if you're not loving, it's nothing. Even in marriage, stuff like that, right? Like you could provide, you could do, I'm doing all this, I'm doing that. But if you don't love them the right way, it's nothing. As parents, same verse, right? You could do all these things for your kids. If you don't love them, it's nothing. Even as a leader, I have a lot of skills, a lot of gifts. I can do things for this church, right? I can make plans and stuff. But if I don't love people the right way, it's nothing. It's nothing. It's not my words. That's what it says here, right? And so this is where it's important. What is this about? About really following Jesus' example. What does it really mean to submit? It's like it starts with love, right? That's why I told you the section started. Love God first, right? Then walk in love. Then love everyone. This is what God has always desired. If you look at they talk about what are the two greatest laws, right? Two greatest commandments. It was love God, love your neighbor as yourself. That was it. Simple, right? Everything's wrapped up under those two things. God has always been about how to love everybody. And usually it's like, in order to love everybody, you got to love God first. And so we'll look at the second half of this, right? Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. So when Paul is saying submit to others and love them the way Christ does, here's your example. This is what you must do in all these ways. Be patient, be kind, right? Not boasting, not rude, not insisting on your own way, not being irritable, not rejoicing at wrongdoing. Because I think I was first I did it more towards marriage, and I revamped this sermon. But basically, like the first examples was like even like husbands and wives. A lot of times, depending on what culture you are, right? My culture is more of like women do serve the men at home, right? And so a lot of the examples like, when a man comes home, he's supposed to have a hot meal or all this other stuff ready for him. And so it was, if you follow this text, it was kind of like if if the husband comes home and is like, man, I've worked a long day, I would love to have a hot meal and have my feet rubbed, right? And he's like, but if that's his desire, that's okay. That could be his desire. But if he's supposed to submit and do to others what he wants done to him, right? If his wife had a hard day, then he's like, I should rub her feet and cook for her. Does that make sense? Based on this text, that's what it tells you, right? Based on loving and submitting, you're supposed to give them what you want. Does that make sense? I've worked with a lot of cultures that are more male-dominant. Men speak a lot more, right? Women, I've seen more extremes than you guys probably understand, but like I said, I've worked in Middle Eastern countries, things like that, where women aren't even allowed to speak to other men, right? You have to speak to the child to tell his mom what to do. That's just the way it works, right? That's not, but that's what I'm saying. I've seen a lot of things. But I've seen these cultures where it's like, women can't speak, right? And so I met a lot of loudmouth men that love to talk and love to be heard and want to give their opinion about everything, right? And they don't ever let their wives do it. So it's always funny. It's like if you're supposed to love your wife the way you're loved, if you love to talk, be heard, and give your opinion, then what does that mean you have to let your wife do? Talk nonstop and you have to listen, right? Right? That's what I mean, obviously there's more to this context. There's more to these, but that's what we think about it, right? When we're talking about submission, all this other stuff where it's like putting the other person first. And so, but this is this kind of levels of love, right? So even for myself, like I'll be honest, I can't live up to this list here, right? I'm not very patient. When I'm not getting what I want or things are taking too long, I get very frustrated. You guys probably were like, yeah, sometimes he's arrogant, right? Do boast a lot. Sometimes I envy. A lot of times I'm rude, right? I like to think I'm kind, but I do say stuff that hurts people's feelings, things like that. I don't love the way I'm supposed to. Do I insist on its own ways? I'm a very headstrong guy. Even in that story I told you, right? Like I wanted to make sure I took care of these soldiers. I didn't care what their leader said. I always try to find a way. It is very tough for me to love in a way that submits my ways under other people's. In that way, if I can't, then I'm very irritable. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing. The pattern of my life, when I'm frustrated with leaders or like things aren't happening at the time or I can't do what I want, sometimes I do a lot of wild, crazy stuff that I should not do, right? A lot of my stories usually were because I was frustrated, right? So as a Christian, obviously that's not the way it's supposed to be. As a Christian leader, it's not supposed to be the way it is. I was telling somebody that a lot of times the reason why I do crazy stuff nowadays is just to hide so you can't tell when I'm actually frustrated. So if I'm just crazy all the time, you won't be able to know when I'm frustrated or when I'm not feeling love, not loving the right way. Right? So obviously that's not the right way to do it, and I'm trying to improve on it, but this is what I'm saying, like it is this level of love that we're supposed to do, right? Even rejoicing with truth. I don't always speak the truth to people that I'm frustrated with, right, for a lot of reasons, and then even to bear all things, hope all things, endure all things, right? I shared, you guys know my pattern. I worked at like so many different churches, right? I've moved around a lot. A lot of it has to do with God moving me. I haven't had control over that, but I've not ever been willing to endure everything, right? There's certain times where I'm like, I want to leave, or I want to go because of this, or, I just want to go, right? And so I'm not willing to endure. I'm not willing to endure the way Christ did. I'm not willing to endure to that level. And that's where it's like, you can do a lot of good things, Joaquin, but God's like, you got to this is the list you should be working on most of all, right? So I'm right there with you, understanding that this is what we're supposed to do. And so the question then becomes, how are we supposed to grow in this way? How are we supposed to love this way? And it starts with, on the back page, we're supposed to submit to Christ to love others the right way. This is why that section, Paul keeps hinting at Christ, 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 over and over again. If you follow that example, everything will be right. If you follow that example, everything will work out the way it did and the way it's supposed to. It comes down to you being willing to submit to Christ. If you submit to him, for him and for everybody, you will then do what you're supposed to do, and you will love the way you're supposed to do. And so this is where it's important to understand, right, what the submission means. So the first thing is, like, submission is for us to help people be holy. Because sometimes it just seems like you got to follow and let them do whatever they want to do. That's not what that means. That's not what Jesus did. Jesus did not let people just do whatever they wanted. He didn't just let them continue to be away from God. He didn't let them continue to go against God. He's like, I'm going to submit in a way that shows you a better way to live, a better way to love, and a better way to follow. Right? I'm going to follow the orders that I think are best for me and everybody else. And I'm following the orders that will help me be holy, everybody be holy. Right? And so this is where it's kind of like, that's what submission's about. Even when Paul's writing about husbands and wives, he's like, you lead in a way to help them be holy. Right? Because that's why I told you, the wives at the time, right? They're one of 6, one of 7. So how can you make this man want to be true to one and be true to the one God? Your conduct, everything that goes after that. Even for the husbands and wives at the time. Even women at the time, if you had a lot of wealth and money, you didn't have to follow the rules, and you could sleep around, do all this other stuff. Right? So even for women in that place, Paul is kind of saying, like, because there's a reason why Paul is very strict on some of the women in Ephesus and Corinth, because they had a lot of influence and could lead a lot of people to bad stuff. And so that's why Paul is writing it. Like, even as husbands, you need to submit in a way to help make your wife be holy. Make her help her follow Christ and God. So that's how you would set the example, by your behavior, by your attitudes, right? How you did things under God's orders, under God's leading. That's how you would then lead your wife to want to do the same. And so this is where it's important. Whenever you're trying to have that conversation about what it looks like for you to submit or not, this is what it comes down to. Will this choice that I make help people become holy? Will it help me stay holy? Right? So that's where it says, it's not about following people's orders. The next point says, we do not have to give up who we are. Union is meant to be 100-100. So there's a reason why Jesus is more important in this text than husband and wives. Is that it's the whole point of Jesus sets the example of perfect union. We see Jesus as 100% human, 100% God. Right? How do we understand how that works fully? Like, that's one of the most debated topics. But he's supposed to be 100-100. Right? Our faith is foundational about that. But even for him and the Father, they are both 100-100. That's where this relationship, that's why when it said the mystery is profound, how they can become one flesh when they're both separate. That's what Christ is trying to show us. Why I said, why he follows God's example is because they're so one, they're so unified in mission, but that never takes away who they are. They're always each other. They're always themselves. Does that make sense? Because that's why that Genesis text, that they shall become one flesh. Marriage has come in, a lot of times marriage has shifted over different cultures, different generations, but this whole belief of like, I got to give up myself, you got to give up this, that's not what it means. That's not what it ever meant. The reason why he's re-quoting Genesis, does anybody know why it says they become one flesh? Any guesses? Because before they get married, they belong to their family. They were one flesh with their parents. They always sought what's best for their parents. The parents always sought what's best for their kids. They were always one. Does that make sense? So now when they're becoming married, that's where God's like, you're going to separate from your parents, so you can't just be all one for them. Now you're supposed to be one with this new wife, new husband. But you're both supposed to be equal. Does that make sense? Because even the whole child and parenting thing throughout Israel's history, right? Parents always take care of kids when they're younger. Parents have to do a lot, right? So it's a little bit more lopsided. But when parents are older and they can't take care of themselves, the kids always had to take care of them. Right? It was always you're one, you're one, you're one. Everything that happens to you happens to us. Right? It was always 1-1-1. But you were always your individual selves. You were always bringing who you were. God made you special. God made you to bring in that union. So even with God and Christ, we see this. They're always one, but they're always different roles. But they're always 100% God. They're all, that's why there's so many teachings behind that. But it's always about you're always 100 in each relationship. And so that's where even why submission is hard sometimes when we feel like we're not being able to be 100. Even as fellow Christians, why is it hard to submit to each other? Because we feel like we got to give up who we are. We got to give up something about ourselves, and we can't be 100. But that's what you're experienced, that's what you're used to, but that's not what it's like. That's not how everybody's like. Does that make sense? The reason why I love being a soldier was because that's how a lot of them thought. It's not just about us anymore, right? I always tell people, like every soldier, they would carry a picture of their families in their wallets, right? This is before phones. We didn't carry. I mean, you can't carry phones anymore anyways. But basically, you had to keep like old-fashioned, right? So everybody has a picture of their family that they want to get home to. Anytime they see somebody about to die, they think that family's going to lose somebody, they're willing to give up their own family to save that person to go back to their family. Isn't that kind of cool? Does that make sense? Because they know they carry the same picture. So there's this kind of like we're 100. We have this level of love. I want what's most for you. The reason why we survive, the reason why we're good at what we do is because we're a unified front of every single one of us caring for each other 100. Does that make sense? And so that's why we're able to do what we do. But that's the perfection of that level of like if everybody's 100, then all of a sudden everybody gets to live out their dreams. Everybody gets to get the support. Everybody gets to have the love that they deserve, right? And so even for myself, like I remember like this is me and my brother, right? Even brother, that's why I said like the way God says you love, it goes into every relationship, even brotherly love. Me and my brother, we grew up working at my parents' shop. Every day we were off of school, we had to be at the shop. I worked 7 days a week. My parents didn't believe in Sabbath back then. I don't know why. But a lot of times they would take Sunday off to be there for my younger brother and my sister, and it would only be me and my older brother at the shop. And so we mostly dealt with Hispanics, right? So most Hispanics were in church, Catholic church, right, on Sunday, so we didn't have a lot of customers. So we'd just be sitting there doing nothing for hours at a time, asking our parents to just let us close the shop. But they never would. And so me and him had so much time to talk and get close. We would share all these different things. So I remember when he was in high school, I was in 8th grade. I think he was a senior, I was in 8th grade. And so he was sharing all his dreams about what he wanted. I would share my dreams. His dream was to have a family, be married, right, have kids, all this other stuff. Like he was like, man, I would love to just do all these things, pour into my kids and stuff like that. And I'm like, man, I really want that for you, right? Like that'd be really cool. My dream as an 8th grader was to travel the world, going to war, and wiping out all these bad people. I just had weird dreams like that. But that's how I looked at it. I always just saw like people were suffering around the world, right? I was like, I want to go to wars. I want to go fight and use my God-given gifts. So my brother was like, I hope that for you. Like, I really hope you can go travel, do all that stuff, go fight. Like, it's true. Like, you have those gifts. And so as kids, we were dreaming. We're encouraging each other to live our dreams, right? When I left to go to the Army, my brother had to pay a heavy price because I was always away. I was always gone. He never knew what was happening to me. Even after I finished my first contract, I signed up again to keep going back and fighting and doing stuff. He was very heartbroken. He was like, how come he doesn't want to be with us? How come he doesn't want to spend time with us? How come he doesn't want to be there? Right? My dad had to tell him like why, right? And explain to him, it's like, it's not that he don't want to be there with you. It's just he knows he can help people go back to their families, right? He wants people to have what you guys have. So he's got to be the one that pays the price. So it helped my brother get through that mindset. But for years, right, he had to live with that, like, I'm always gone. And so when he got married, he ended up getting married like 6 years ago. I was the best man, of course, right? And so I gave a best man speech, and I told him, I'm going to give you a best man speech that makes you cry. And he's like, what? I don't think so. And I told you guys, my brother doesn't cry a lot. And so I gave him, what I said to him in the speech was that, after, seeing, me live out my dreams, what it cost him, knowing now as he's getting married, right, he was marrying a woman with a daughter, it's like all your time is consumed with that family, right? So we were always hanging out every day. We were doing all this other stuff together, going to class, right? Always talking ministry, talking life. And so I was like, I know that hasn't happened anymore now that you've been dating and getting married, right? For the last, year or so, we've been drifting apart. But I'm like, it's great that you have that wife. It's great that you're living out your dream. And so I was like, if we were knowing now what it costs for you to have your dream and what it costs for me to have my dream, if we were to go back to our younger selves when we were talking at the shop, right? And we were talking about, I want this for you, I want that for you. If we were to tell our younger selves, hey, if you really want that for your brother, this is what it's going to cost you. And if you want that for your brother, this is what it's going to cost you. Do you really want that still? Me and my brother would both be like, absolutely.
I don't care what I have to pay. I want their dream more than I want my dream of being with them. Does that make sense? That was the 100-100. That's what it looks like. That's when you're trying to find God's love of like, I want everything for them. And then that person returns, I want everything for you. That's what Jesus is trying to build for us with God and for us with everybody around us. 100-100 type love where everything we are, everything that we want, we're all working together to achieve it. We're all working together to encourage each other. We're all working each other to even hold each other accountable. Does that make sense? That's the beauty of this love, where it's like true love does not want its own way. It wants everything else, right? Because I like the song you guys picked. That verse in the first song, I wrote it down. It says, it changes what we see and what we seek, right? When we talk about even marriage or whatever relationship that you have, when you have Christ's love inside of you, you no longer, when you're seeing about submitting to somebody else, you're no longer seeing as you losing something for yourself. You're looking at it as, hey, this is what's beneficial for that person. This will help their faith. This will help them grow. This will be the best thing for them. So then that's why we seek what's best for them, right? Because that's what Jesus did for us. He saw us. He's seen what we were struggling with. He's like, I know they need help. I'm going to seek to do whatever it takes to help them be back to who they were meant to be. Help them get back all the things that they've lost because of sin. Get back all the things that they've lost because they've had bad love and they haven't had God love. All right, so this is why we're supposed to do it. And honestly, we know that it's really hard to do it because we have our selfish reasons, right? But that's where God's kind of like, you don't have to give up being selfish. You just have to now look at everybody else as equal. If you do that, technically, you will get far more greater things than you ever imagined, right? Even in that's why I shared that story where it was kind of like why I fed those guys, right? In reality, I wanted to save their lives, but imagine if I didn't do what I was meant to do, I wouldn't have been able to live with that choice, right? Like there would have been physical consequences. But even this new way of living, because like I said, I wasn't always the most kind. I didn't always think it was necessary to eat. Like that's why if you know what kind of soldier I was, and most of the guys knew me, I trained them to starve. I trained them to go months without eating. I trained them to go months without sleeping, right? We could do it and not have anything stop us. That's how I trained my guys. But I did not make them live the way I lived. Does that make sense? I was like, that's not how I saw it. As I'm reading all those books of God and studying those classes, I was like, he's not making me have people live the way I do. He's making me live in a way that thinks of them first. And so because of that, that's what shaped my heart. That's what made me somebody that actually is like, no matter what is in front of me, I'm going to use love as to the max that I can, right? So it's like if eating a lunch is the most important, I'm going to make eating lunch that day the most important thing that I do that day, right? And so because I've had that mindset, it's now allowed me to live, the rest of my time in the Army very well, but even as a pastor. Every single thing that I do, I look at it as a chance to love people to the max. This could be the most important event in their life. Who knows if it could lead to death or not, right? Because a lot of times we're like physical death, maybe, but even spiritual death. Sometimes there's certain key things in people's life where they had nobody support them. They had nobody encourage them, nobody to love them. And then all of a sudden they just went downhill from there. Does that make sense? And sometimes, that there is personal responsibility for that person's choice. But at the same time, there's personal responsibility of did I love that person in that opportunity that God gave me? So every opportunity I get, I act like it's the Super Bowl. I act like it's the most important thing in everybody's life, right? Even learning how to do crafting, learning how to do just helping with crafting, baking, cooking, stuff like that, right? You ask what most people are like, this guy works like crazy. Because that's what I've learned from that experience. That's what I've learned from God. Like, you treat everything like it could be the most important thing. Even here at church, I joke, right? Like, you guys know I cook every single week. When I started this job, there was no cooking, right? Fridays, you guys didn't eat. You guys had snacks. And then Sundays, it was always catered, right? So for me, coming in, I was like, the best way I could love my people has always been to feed them, right? That's why I said, like, that's always the way I've always been able to, like, pour into their lives. It's so important to me. And I was like, this church will not give me that chance. And so I was like, God, right? It was like my baking hands, like, come on, God. Like, I was like, what are you doing, God? And that's where he's like, submit and it'll work out, right? Trust my plan, trust how it's going to work out. And so for a year, I didn't cook. And it was not looking like I was ever going to cook again. When we started back in person for the youth, I asked all the youth leaders, hey, should I cook for the youth on Fridays, right? Or things like that. All of them are like, no, don't cook for them. Like, that's going to spoil them. They don't need that, right? And so all the leaders at the time said, don't cook for them. I think one person said I should do it. The other, it was 3-1, right? So they're like, don't cook for them. So as a leader, I had to submit, right? This is what I love to do. This is my best way to cook. But if they say not to, I'm going to submit to their decision. I'll find another way to love. And so after the first week we met in person, I had a bunch of pizzas, right? I bought some for myself, and then I was worried about the leaders coming from work and stuff. I was like, maybe they might need a snack just in case, right? I'm always about just in case. And so I was like, I'm going to have extra food just in case these leaders need it. And so one youth ended up showing up at 6:30, right? It starts at 8, but somehow this person showed up at 6:30. I was like, why are you here so early? You're messing up my setup. And they were like, I'm actually kind of hungry. I skipped dinner to get here. And I was like, you could have just went home, ate, and come back. But this person was here, and so I was like, go ahead and have some pizza, right? I was like, I'm willing to share. So as I went to go set up everything, as all the youth started showing up, this person just kept telling people, oh, yeah, go ahead. He said, eat it, eat it, eat it. And so by the time 8 o'clock showed up, there was no pizza left. I had no dinner. Right? I was like, hey, like, what happened to my pizza? Right? It was like 3 pizzas, right? I ordered more than enough. I was like, I even had some for the next day, just after being hungry from leading a big group. I was like, dang, I got nothing. But that's where I realized, like, hey, all these, because that's why I said a lot of youth come from, activities, stuff like that. They're hungry. So that gave me the justification with my leaders, like, hey, they're all hungry. I get to feed them. I'm going to try cooking and see what happens. Does that make sense? And so God's where, like, every week I cook, and I try to cook the best I can, because that's God's answer to my prayer of how can I help love them? How can I make sure that I can submit to them in a way that helps them wherever they're at, whatever they're going through? Does that make sense? So that's where I said, like, God's plan was funny. Like, he put me in a place that didn't seem obvious that it was going to work. For over a year, I didn't ever cook. So it was kind of like, okay, you think I'd give up on that dream. But God's like, I know Joaquin's never given up on that dream. And number 2, I'm already working on a plan that's going to make it happen. Because without the Chinese coming back in person, that's what allowed us to have fun. And so I was like, thank you, God. Because that's why, like, nobody was here on Sunday. We had fire pits. We were doing all kinds of wild. We were having a lot of fun. But that's where God allowed us to love that way. Does that make sense? But that's why I said the submission work, just trusting God even when you don't see how it's going to work down the road. It all works. He knows what kind of love we're supposed to have. He knows what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, right? And so this is where it said, like, if you really want to love your people well, truly understand that it comes to submitting to God and then looking for his ways. His ways will always be better, and his ways will make sure you get everything, they get everything, everybody gets everything. All right? And so that's why we're pushing for this level of love. So the last applications, memorize 1 Corinthians 13, 1-7. Do your best to try to understand these words, live them out. Anytime you don't know what to do, when you're facing a struggle of when to submit or how to love, recite the words back to yourself, right? Let these things fuel your actions. After you've recited them, ask God and Christ what you should do next. How do I love? Look over this list, see what areas you struggle with. Work out a plan with a trusted friend or leader to improve in that area so that you can better love your people. And then the last one, pray for the strength of Christ to help you love people, all the people he has put in your life the way he wants. It's always funny to give this sermon where you got to kind of like talk people into loving people better, right? This sermon could easily be like, hey, don't you want to love your people the best? Don't you want to give them the best love you could possibly give? You care about them that much? Yeah? All right, let's go do some applications. Sermon over, right? That's all it should really take. It's kind of funny that we got to be convinced to like try to love better. Part of it is sin. Part of it is just our selfish ways. Part of it is just understanding that it actually works when you do it the right way. And so I encourage you, right? If you love the people that God has put in your life, if you understand that he's giving you all the relationships that he's given you, then do your best to love them the best. Do your best to love them like Christ, whether they're your friends, your parents, church members, whether they're even your enemies at the time. The whole point is to love them the best. God gave them to you for some reason. You may not know why. There's a lot of people here that I don't know why God gave them to me. There's some people that frustrate me. And it's funny, though. You know what frustrates me the most? People that are a lot like me. The way if they think like me or do stuff like that's what frustrates me. And it's kind of funny when I take it to God, like, God, why is this person doing this or doing that? It just makes God laugh. Like, are you seriously complaining about that type of behavior? Like, you are the master of that behavior, right? But that's what we see. Like, God is using every single thing to help us grow to love them. And so I put at the very bottom, right? Make every second count. Make every breath count. Use every breath to fuel you to love like Christ. This is what it's all about. This is what Paul is telling them. This is what Christ's example was. Every day, nonstop, love, love, love. Even when he took rest, even when he took Sabbath, he wanted to make sure people appreciated taking rest and having time for God and rejuvenating. Does that make sense? Even to take a break was him loving us by saying, I'm going to show you how to trust the Father and take a break because he's the one working as well. Does that make sense? So every action he took, every breath, every single thing that he did was to help show us how to love. And so it's not easy to do every single breath, every moment. But at the same time, isn't that what you would want for every person that you love? Isn't that what you'd want for your wife, for your kids, right? For your parents, for you to love them the best way possible with every breath you get? Wouldn't you want to love every church member here with every breath you get to love them like Christ? To somebody that's outside the church, somebody that is lost, hurt, right, going through all kinds of pain, wouldn't you want to love them with every breath like Christ would? And so I'll leave it at your feet. Leave that challenge to you. I'm going to try my best to get there. I've been pretty close. I was eating with Frank yesterday. I've been pretty close, right? Especially in the Army soldiers. I gave 95% of all my breaths to take care of them. But I've never been able to hit the 100. And it's because I never was 100% submitted to Christ. I was never 100% submitted to loving the way he wanted. And so even now, that's where God's like, you know you want to love 100%. And you know that what's stopping you. So let's keep working till you get to 100. So it's a challenge for you. It's a challenge for myself to make every breath count and to use every breath to love like Christ. So please join me as we close in prayer.